Chapter 1477, 10 Killing Formations. Chapter 1477, 10 Killing Formations. Inside the Black Tower, underneath the reincarnation tree, Ling Han and Empress Luanxing sat down on the ground and worked earnestly on their comprehension. One was determined to rush up to Eternal River Tier in the shortest time possible, while the other wanted to fully grasp the yin-yang five-element formation and inscribe it on his bones so that he would become a human killing formation. Time passed very quickly. In the blink of an eye, a year had passed. Under the reincarnation tree, the two people that seemed to have turned into stone suddenly moved and opened their eyes practically at the same time. Exchanging a look, both revealed a smile. I can attempt to break through to Eternal River Tier. I have fully understood the formation. Both of them were filled with confidence. Their battle prowess would soon be greatly boosted. They exited the Black Tower. A year had passed, and naturally, no one was still watching for them outside the library. They boldly walked out and returned to their own courtyard. When the senior students heard the news and appeared, the couple had entered into their rooms, and naturally, they could only hop around in fury. Ling Han opened his cauldron and began refining alchemical pills. Breaking through to Eternal River Tier was not something to be done casually. It required the accumulation of a frightening amount of origin power, or it would be one's own life force that would be exhausted. There were many people who had not accumulated enough, and their own life force was not strong enough, either. Ultimately, their life force was completely exhausted, and they ended up dying from exhaustion. Thus, this could not be rushed. The best alchemical pill for breaking through to the Eternal River Tier was the Great Amplification Pill. It could not increase one's comprehension, but could supply endless amounts of origin power, and allow cultivators to be spared from the fate of being sucked dry by their soaring cultivation level. Ordinarily, about 100 pills was enough. However, for the sake of his wife, Ling Han was naturally not going to be satisfied with a mere 100. He refined over 1,000 in one go, and only then did he stop in discontent. Though this was one of the higher grade pills among level 12 divine pills, the time needed to refine it was extremely short. He could refine a cauldron's worth in a single day. With Ling Han's abilities, he could refine about 20 pills in a single batch. Thus, the matter was completely settled in 50 days. Even if she didn't use all of them, that was fine. Wouldn't he also have to break through? And there was the Rain Emperor, the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden, and the others. There were plenty of people that would need them. He handed the alchemical pills over to Empress Luanxing, and the Empress took the lead in going into seclusion for the breakthrough. Ling Han called Juyao over, and asked him about what had happened in this year's time. Taking the new students down a notch was a tradition of the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy, and was not merely limited to the 8th campus. It was a rule that was present in every campus. Ling Han was not the only one who had attempted to resist. The Rain Emperor had resisted, Jiyu Dawi had resisted, Ding Ping had resisted, and the Notionless Saint had resisted, but it was useless. No matter how much of a prodigy you were, you would still be limited by your cultivation level. How would a heavenly body tier be any match for an Eternal River Tier? Even those at the peak of the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier were only equivalent to being at the low extreme of the Eternal River Tier, and would obviously only be suppressed. Such proud people like the Rain Emperor and Jiyu Dawi had battled to the last moment. But they were not as fortunate as Ling Han and Empress Luanxing, wherein a big shot had stepped out to block the fires for their sake. Even if Jiyu Dawi possessed a saint tool, it had only led to the mobilization of a senior student in the medium extreme of the Eternal River Tier to suppress him. Most people had obediently crawled through the dog hole, and troublemakers were all knocked unconscious and forcibly shoved through. In short, none were spared. Apparently, Jiyu Dawi had fallen ill from his infuriation after the matter, and had only recovered after lying in bed for a good few months. After Ling Han heard this, he couldn't help but grin. He could understand. Jiyu Dawi was the first Severance Grand Elder from the Celestial Realm, and now, he was forced to crawl into a dog hole by a few Eternal River Tiers. The shadow in his heart had to be indescribably huge. Yet the fact that the Rain Emperor, the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden, and the others had suffered this humiliation as well caused Ling Han's eyes to grow cold. He was determined to seek an accounting for this debt. But this required strength. Without strength, everything was mere words. Ling Han taught some cultivation technique to Jouyao, and told him to send it over to the Rain Emperor and the others. It was definitely of a higher grade than what could be obtained in the Starsand Martial Arts Academy. Meanwhile, he himself immediately went into seclusion. He was going to begin inscribing formation patterns in his body, and inscribe the Yin-Yang 5-element formation. In the year of comprehension previously spent under the reincarnation tree, he had already grasped this formation technique. And now, it was the time to turn his understanding into reality. However, it was extremely difficult to inscribe on one's godly bones. One would have to use their divine sense like a blade, and make the inscriptions bit by bit. At any other time, Ling Han would definitely be unable to do so. Because his success came from his physique, and so did his failure. His godly bones were as high a grade as level 13 and above, and were close to level 14. Even he himself could not do anything to them, so how was he supposed to inscribe the formation patterns? Thankfully, he now had the 9 heavens flame. This was not only an immortal flame, but was also one of the 9 great ancestral flames, and now, it had become his essence divine flames, and could be commanded by his will. Inscribing on his godly bones had thus become possible. Ling Han inscribed one formation pattern after another. His speed could not be considered fast, but was not slow, either. There were only a total of 3,600 formation patterns for the Yin-Yang 5-element formation, and he would be able to inscribe around 20 in 2 hours. Thus, in a mere half-month's time, he had completely inscribed the entire formation on his skeleton. Wasn't it said that everyone could only inscribe a single set of formation patterns inside his body? Ling Han was slightly surprised. That was because after he had inscribed a whole set of formation patterns, he had actually used up just 1/10 of his bones. I understand. This is because I used the immortal flame as my blade, so the formation patterns that I inscribed are extremely detailed and even, so the bones occupied would be less. Going by that understanding, wouldn't I then be able to inscribe a few great formations inside my body at the same time? If I activate them at the same time, the might. Haha. Then I will inscribe 10 Yin-Yang 5-element formations. Ling Han persisted in his efforts, and inscribed another 9 formations on his godly bones. He had used up a total of 5 months' time to finish the project. Ling Han came out of seclusion, while Empress Luan Xing was still in seclusion. Breaking through to the Eternal River tier was not something to be accomplished in 1 or 2 days. However, one should not let go of the big prize while grabbing at trifles. I should still concentrate on martial arts. If I could break through to the Eternal River tier, I would be able to inscribe level 15 formations, and would be a match for the high extreme of the Eternal River tier. And if I could inscribe 10 formations, then it would not be difficult to kill even a cultivator at the peak of the high extreme of Eternal River tier. Haha, this would be my trump card. Who would have thought? The Tranquil Heart Saint would only host a seminar every 3 years, and counting the days, it should be these few days. I can go and listen. In future, if I want to inscribe saint-level formation patterns inside my body, I need a very deep understanding of the path of formations. Additionally, I would have to teach Jouyao and Ding Ping too, or I would be too irresponsible as their master. Ling Han walked out of his courtyard and headed to where the Tranquil Heart Saint would speak about Tao. The venue was a public square, and all disciples were free to listen. However, it was definitely only close disciples that could listen to the information that truly involved saint-level knowledge. The moment he stepped out, he could see a person sneakily poke his head in. When he realized that Ling Han's eyes had swept over him, he hurriedly shrunk his head back and broke out in a run. Obviously, he had set out to inform the others. Ling Han did not stop him. What would come would come. In any case, he had already disclosed the fact that he had a spatial god tool, and he could use it without any reservations. After all, saints would be able to create spatial god tools, so it was not something that others would sacrifice everything to snatch it from him. Ling Han. He had not arrived at the public square when someone stood in his way. This was an elite in the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier. There was no need for the high extreme or the consummate level. The medium extreme was more than enough. If that was still incapable to suppress a mere heavenly body tier, What justice was left in this world? Ling Han showed a smile. The medium extreme? Very good, this was just the chance for him to test out the might of the yin-yang 5-element formation. Chapter 1478, The Killing Formation Shows its Mai. 1478 The Killing Formation Shows its Mai. The one standing in his way was a tall man with broad shoulders. He looked to be about in his 30s, and had been in the academy for an unknown number of years. It would probably be a very astonishing number of years, or he couldn't have possibly attained the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier. Advancing into the Eternal River tier itself needed a very, very long time. What more when he had advanced to the medium extreme? A dog blocking the way? Ling Han asked, smiling calmly. Wang, whom are you insulting? The large black dog appeared and disappeared unpredictably, and had extremely good hearing. He popped out in an instant. Brat, you dare look down on Grandpa Dog hiss. His dog's eyes widened in a glare directed at Ling Han. All the black fur on his body was standing on ends, and one of his tails was even standing upright like a javelin out of his steel undergarment. What medicine have you ingested, brat? Why are you giving Grandpa Dog a very scary feeling? The large black dog exclaimed in surprise. Ling Han was involuntarily shocked. This damn dog's senses were really sharp. Could it be that he had discovered the 10 killing formations inscribed in his body? He should not know the reason for it, but still could sense this kind of oppressive pressure, as expected of a dog that had been brought from the celestial realm. However, he was still a damn dog. Are you two finished? The man standing in the way was angered. Are the two of you playing around with me with your banter? Ling Han couldn't help but smile, and asked, You called me, so what business do you have to do with me? You are asking a question that you already know the answer to. The man smirked coldly. I am Jiao Liang, and have entered the academy 18 million years ago. I am your senior brother. Now that you have met me, should you not respectfully address me as senior brother? Ling Han waved a hand. Since you already said that I asked the question while knowing the answer, then I will ask you as well. If someone wants to slap your face, will you still politely address him as senior brother? The large black dog immediately interrupted and quipped, Right, wouldn't that be being wretched? Jiao Liang's expression involuntarily darkened even further. At first, he had wanted to put on airs as a senior brother, and make Ling Han feel sullen first, yet he had not thought that Ling Han would actually be such a hoodlum that he would not give face to even him. A troublemaker was still a troublemaker, after all. No wonder he had dared to challenge the tradition of the academy. Unfortunately, his strength was too weak. Since you are still so stubborn, then as your senior brother, I can only choose to teach you what respect is. He made his move without any reservations. He stretched out a palm, and Wang, a silver river unfolded and heavenly bodies floated in the air. Though he was an elite of formations, the gap in their cultivation levels was too large. Merely with his own power, he would be able to completely suppress Ling Han, so what need was there for him to use the power of formations? Using a sledgehammer on a nut? This junior brother would not be worth him doing that. It was a simple palm, yet covered the ground and shadowed the skies. This was the strength of the Eternal River tier. A casual strike would be able to drive the great power of the heaven and earth. Heavenly body tiers were completely no match for that. Ling Han naturally dared not be careless, either. With a thought, the 10 killing formations activated at the same time. Suddenly, the bones in his body lit up one by one, but because his physique was too powerful, his skin, flesh, and blood had forcibly concealed this kind of radiance, and at a glance, he was still incredibly ordinary. Yet the large black dog's fur stood on ends once more. He leaped 9 meters high into the air, and hurriedly ran in retreat. He had sensed that there seemed to be a frightening monster hidden inside Ling Han's body, and could easily kill even him. The reason why he was cunning was because he was highly skilled in the art of running for his life. Otherwise, if he would be turned into a dead dog at any random move, how could he possibly dare to be so arrogant? Ling Han casually waved his hand, and the lightning sword technique appeared, slicing towards Jiao Liang. Overestimating your own abilities. Jiao Liang humphed coldly. A heavenly body tier actually dared face him head-on. No matter how freakishly talented he was fated to lose. This brat thought that he could consider everyone else beneath him just because he had defeated a few in the low extreme of the Eternal River tier? What a joke! Zhao Liang was in the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier. Suppress. His right hand shook, and his fingers turned into a prison of heaven and earth, descending onto Ling Han. The fingers descended. They were obviously only 5 fingers, yet seemed like mountain peaks. Break. Ling Han stated indifferently. Sword chi struck. Boom, the mountain of 5 fingers were easily severed into pieces. Zhao Liang's mouth involuntarily gaped. This was too inconceivable. That was his attack, the attack of the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier. How could it possibly be so easily and calmly broken? If you really had that kind of abilities, why would you have been so strained in the deadly battle with the 13 elites in the low extreme of the Eternal River tier? That day, he, too, had witnessed the battle, and he could claim to be fully aware of the depth of Ling Han's abilities. If Ling Han's abilities could undergo such a massive transformation in a mere year's time, he definitely would not believe that. That had to be a lie. For those who had reached this kind of height like them, the time needed to improve their abilities by just a bit would have to be 10,000 years, and that was the minimum. What more when this wasn't just a bit, but rather 10,000 time. I've underestimated you. Though Zhao Liang was surprised, he did not lose his head. He had not used his full power in that last strike at all. At this moment, the bones inside his body glowed one after another. A killing formation was activated, and suddenly, the light of the 5 elements and the chi of yin-yang appeared on the surface of his body. The formation he had inscribed was actually the yin-yang 5-element formation as well. Get lost, he shouted loudly, and activated the formation's might to the fullest, not daring to underestimate Ling Han in the slightest bit any longer. This rookie was really too unique. Ling Han smiled calmly. You only have a single yin-yang 5-element formation, and as for me, 10. In a clash of 10 against 1, would I still be unable to beat a piece of trash like you? With a gesture of his finger, the lightning sword technique unfolded to the fullest, and underneath the rolling heaven's might was the massive explosion of 10 yin-yang 5-element formations. Boom! Zhao Liang greeted the attack with his own formation, an expression of disdain on his face. He was sure that all the bones in Ling Han's body would be completely shattered under the crushing suppression of this attack. Of course, he would be careful and not kill Ling Han, nor would he damage his life force. This was the great taboo of the academy. However, his expression immediately became one of utter shock. That was because his attack fell apart with a single strike from Ling Han. How is this possible? The attack that should have been unable to resist a single blow should have been Ling Han's. Why was the tables turned around on him? Boom, wearing an expression of unfathomable disbelief, so much that he looked like he was doubting life itself, Zhao Liang was sent flying. He sputtered out a mouthful of blood that sprayed out into the skies, and seemed like a rainbow under the radiant sunlight. He landed heavily on the ground, and caused the dirt to fly up in a wave. A deathly silence fell over the surroundings. Ling Han was a celebrity now. Though he was a troublemaker that broke the rules in the eyes of the seniors, that did not stop him from becoming famous not only because of his nature-defying performance on the first day, but also because he had an exquisitely beautiful wife that would make anyone drool. When Zhao Liang appeared, those that planned to watch the excitement had naturally appeared as well to watch the battle, but who would have imagined that this would be the result? This was unrealistic. This was illogical. They must have seen a ghost. Everyone could not help but rub their eyes, and then look again, but the one lying on the ground was still Zhao Liang. He had really defied nature this time round. Everyone knew that the peak of the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier was equivalent to the strength of the low extreme of the Eternal River tier, and strength did not represent battle prowess. Hence, some freaks were capable of matching even those at the middle stage, late stage, and even peak stage of the low extreme of the Eternal River tier. That was still something that everyone could accept. But this time, it was an elite in the medium extreme, and furthermore, was not one in the early stage of the medium extreme, either, but rather in the late stage. What the heck? Everyone could feel their hair stand on ends, as if their heads would be exploding at any second. Chapter 1479 Victory Again. Chapter 1479 Victory Again. At the last moment, Ling Han still withdrew some of the formation's might. Otherwise, this attack would not simply cause injury, but would crush Zhao Liang into dust. Combining these 10 killing formations as one did not simply increase their might by 10 times, but boosted their might 100-fold. Zhao Liang groaned. He felt that all the bones in his body had been broken, and he could not get to his feet at all. Ling Han walked over, and looked down on him. Then he squatted down beside Zhao Liang's head, and said, "Senior brother Zhao, you have not said it yet. Why have you called me over? Sai, you are already quite old, so why are you still so hot-tempered and quick to anger? Can't we talk things out politely?" Fuck. Zhao Liang spat out a mouthful of blood and coughed endlessly as he pointed at Ling Han. If one could kill with a glare, Ling Han would definitely have been ripped into pieces. He was furious. Previously, Ling Han did not call him senior brother at all, and now, though he did, was that respecting him? This was absolutely a slap in his face. It was common knowledge that leaving a line in everything would allow for better relations in future. Going so far, were you planning to become the public enemy of the whole academy? In future, don't just casually talk about violence and murder, be good. Ling Han patted Zhao Liang's face, and then stood up. He still had to go and listen to the Tranquil Heart Saints seminar. The large black dog quickly ran behind him, but after taking a few steps, he couldn't help but turn back around and come back. He raised one of his back legs beside Zhao Liang's head, and a spray of liquid suddenly spewed out. As the saying went, a leopard could not change its spots. This involuntary action of leaving a mark when he met a target was also a habit that was embedded in his blood. Only then did the large black dog chase after Ling Han in satisfaction, but then he realized that he was a great elite. What elite would be prancing around on all 4 legs? Immediately, he stood on his back paws, and walked like he was a human. Zhao Liang was too pitiful. He spat out a successive 13 mouthfuls of blood, his legs stretched out, and he passed out. Actually, Ling Han had seen the dog's action, but did not stop him. Firstly, this was none of his business. Secondly, he had not trifled with anyone, and it was Zhao Liang himself who had approached to ask for a beating. He had merely sought his own humiliation. "Little Black, you are really despicable," Ling Han said sincerely. The old ginseng and the rabbit were only rookies in front of this large black dog. "This is how I am. If you dare say another word about me being despicable, Grandpa Dog will get angry with you." The large black dog swept an eye over Ling Han's neck. "Little Han, will you truly not consider becoming my mount? I can teach you supreme cultivation techniques. Get lost." Ling Han shot out a foot in a kick, but the large black dog was incredibly intelligent. With a leap, he had long since dodged the attempted blow. The man and dog left boldly and openly. At first, it was a complete silence, but then a world-shaking uproar exploded. "My heavens, senior brother Zhao lost. And furthermore, it's a terrible defeat. How could this be possible? Senior brother Zhao is in the late stage of the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier, and furthermore, has inscribed the yin-yang 5-element formation in his body. How could he possibly be no match for a heavenly body tier? Even if I saw it with my own eyes, I do not dare believe it at all. Could it be that the senior brothers in the high extreme would have to move out?" Everyone looked at each other, and suddenly had a feeling that even if those in the high extreme came, it was not certain that they would be able to suppress him. They went off in all directions, hurriedly bringing this astonishing news to even more people. Ling Han had really rocketed into the skies. Even one in the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier could not suppress him. Ling Han and the large black dog had arrived at the public square in the center of the academy. There was a stage as tall as 9 meters in the middle of the public square. There was no one on the stage, but the area around it was already fully occupied. The Tranquil Heart Saint had not arrived yet, and the seminar had not begun. Ling Han breathed a sigh of relief. He had thankfully not missed it. "Little Black, you seem to be doing quite well around here," he asked the large black dog. This despicable dog had not been taken in by any saint, but he had seen him make trouble in the academy quite a few times, and no one had actually stepped out to discipline him. With a flash, he had dodged a sudden bite from the large black dog. The large black dog humphed, and declared, "Call me Grandpa Black. Grandpa Black, got it. Ling Han merely chuckled, and pretended he had not heard him. I am the auspicious sign of heaven and earth, and am loved by all who see me. The large black dog boasted shamelessly. Ling Han really wanted to deliver a kick right at him. He called himself loved by all who saw him. If he was really tossed out, those who wanted to kill him could form a long queue that could wind a good few times around Woodfigure Planet. In only a while, a sudden commotion began among the gathered masses. They whispered furiously to one another, all looking stunned or wearing expressions of disbelief. With Ling Han's ears, he naturally could hear everything clearly. They were all discussing what had happened just now, how he had seriously wounded Zhao Liang with a single blow. That's got to be fake. How could that be possible? That's right, senior brother Zhao is in the late stage of the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier, and furthermore, he has grasped the yin-yang 5-element formation. To defeat him, one would have to be at the peak of the medium extreme, at least. What more to defeat him with a single strike? Only one in the early stage of the high extreme would be able to do that. Don't tell me that a heavenly body tier could possess the battle prowess of the high extreme of the Eternal River tier. I wouldn't believe that even if it killed me. It is absolutely impossible. Even if he had a saint tool, it would still be impossible. Limited by cultivation level, heavenly body tiers definitely could not possibly force too much might out from a saint tool. Everyone was shaking their head. At first, they were stunned, but what quickly followed was doubt. Not a single person believed it. Even those that had witnessed the scene with their own eyes were doubting what they had seen, what more when they were just finding out from hearsay. Ling Han is over there, someone exclaimed suddenly, pointing at Ling Han. Ling Han had not hidden himself, and was just openly standing right there, so he was naturally eye-grabbing. Everyone's eyes were attracted by this pointing gesture. What did the fact that Ling Han had appeared mean? It meant that Zhao Liang had definitely failed to snipe him. Gasp! Could it be that the rumor was true? Ling Han had really defeated Zhao Liang? Xiao, a figure directly flew into the skies above Ling Han. There was a galaxy winding around behind him, exuding an endless aura. This was an elite in the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier, and was also one of the strongest few in the public square. For those big shots like Ren Feiyun and elites of the high extreme of Eternal River tier, they represented the strongest battle prowess of the 8th campus, so they had naturally received favorable treatment from the Tranquil Heart Saint. Usually, they would be called over, and be taught formation Dao of a higher level. In this kind of general seminar, those big shots and supreme elites would not be coming. That was because they would not benefit much even if they did. They had already grasped this knowledge millions of years ago. I do not believe that you are able to defeat Zhao Liang. Take a blow from me. The man did not say another word, and immediately made his move. He stretched out a finger, which formed into a golden spear that swung with suppressive force down on Ling Han. He seemed like he was intending to pierce Ling Han right through. Ling Han was irritated. He clenched a fist and brazenly greeted the incoming blow with his own attack. Peng! The 10 killing formations showed their weight. An endless murderous aura surged out, capable of piercing a hole in the sky itself. It was as if that man was made out of paper. He was sent flying by the force, blood spewing madly from his mouth. Wherever his blood landed, there was a commotion. This was the blood of the Eternal River tier. A single drop was heavier than even a mountain, and more so brought with it his boundless life essence, so its destructive ability was incredibly frightening. Boom! The man collapsed on the ground, foaming from his mouth, his limbs twitching slightly. An uproar erupted. Chapter 1480, Summoned by a Sane. Chapter 1480, Summoned by a Sane. Just then, they had still been saying that Ling Han couldn't possibly have defeated Zhao Liang. They had said that this was merely a rumor. However, what now? Ling Han had defeated another disciple who was just as powerful as Zhao Liang right before their very eyes. He had defeated them head-on, and he hadn't used any underhanded techniques, either. He had achieved a crushing victory with a single strike. Everyone was transfixed with shock. Wang! The sound of the great Tao suddenly traveled over from heaven and earth. At the same time, a golden lotus started to descend from the sky. This was an indescribably blissful scene. This signified the arrival of a saint. Looking up, they could see that the tranquil heart saint had suddenly appeared atop the golden lotus. No one knew how he had arrived, yet it was as if he were always meant to be there. The saint swept his gaze over the cultivators. However, he suddenly paused when he saw Ling Han. A look of astonishment spread across his face. He hadn't used an air of primal chaos to mask his face, and thus everyone could see his expression of astonishment. This saints would be unblinking even if the heavens were to collapse before them. With a casual wave of their hand, they would be able to stabilize and support the sky. Thus, how could they be astonished? What had he detected from Ling Han? It was extraordinary enough to astonish even a saint. However, this also seemed to make sense. After all, who had ever witnessed a heavenly body tier cultivator defeating an eternal river tier elite before? This was an elite at the medium extreme of the eternal river tier, no less. The tranquil heart saint observed Ling Han for a moment longer before retracting his gaze, and saying, "We'll discuss the basic transformations of formations today. Tao begets 1, 1 begets 2, 2 begets 3, and 3 begets all matter." The tranquil heart saint started to teach his disciples, explaining profound principles in simple and easily understandable language. As a saint, his understanding of formations was naturally in-depth and profound. Thus, he was able to clearly explain and analyze all kinds of details easy to miss. The disciples before him continued to nod in realization and understanding. These were things that they would often neglect. However, pondering it carefully, they realized that their grasp of these areas wasn't as solid as they had imagined. There was still much room for improvement. Ling Han also continued to reinforce his knowledge. With this knowledge, he was preparing to tackle saint-level formations. Things that were related to saints were all profound and extraordinary. One would need to accumulate boundless knowledge before they could comprehend saint-level matters. If one wanted to master saint-level formations, they would need to fully comprehend all of the foundations of the Tao of formations. Merely copying the construction of the formations wouldn't be enough. Thus, Ling Han was captivated by the teachings of the saint. Anyhow, he possessed a reincarnation tree, so compared to others, he would have 400 times the amount of time to digest and comprehend this information. The teachings of the saint lasted for half a month. After finishing his teachings, the Tranquil Heart Saint suddenly said, "Ling Han, come to the Tranquil Heart Pavilion." The Tranquil Heart Pavilion was where the Tranquil Heart Saint normally resided. This pavilion was located inside the 8th campus, and it was most certainly a holy land of the academy. Only a rare few people could enter this pavilion. Usually, only the 4 big shots would have the right to enter and seek guidance from the saint. However, how long had Ling Han been in the academy for? Yet, he was already being summoned by a saint. Ling Han nodded in understanding. After the Tranquil Heart Saint left, he started to make his way to the Tranquil Heart Pavilion. This time, no one dared to block him. First of all, even an elite at the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier hadn't been able to block him. Thus, if an elite at the high extreme or consummate level didn't step forward, who would dare to block him? Second of all, he had been summoned by a saint. Who dared to make a saint wait? It's that large black dog. Fuck. The despicable dog has appeared again. Beat it to death. However, the attention of the disciples was instantly drawn away by the large black dog. Everyone stared at the large black dog. Just then, they had been completely focused on the teachings of the saint. As a result, they only discovered the large black dog now. Several thousand disciples instantly charged forward, all of them wearing menacing expressions. It was as if they wanted to swallow the large black dog whole. What kind of deplorable sin had the large black dog committed? He had actually attracted the fury of so many people. Ling Han expressed sympathy in his mind. However, he didn't stop to help. It wasn't long before he arrived before the Tranquil Heart Pavilion. In fact, this was just a small courtyard that had a small pavilion within it. There was an air of antiquity about this place. There was a young boy standing before the gate of the courtyard, and upon seeing Ling Han, he immediately said, "It's senior brother Ling Han, am I right? The saint said that you can enter by yourself." Ling Han glanced at the young boy. He was at the Eternal River tier. Moreover, he was far older than his outward appearance would suggest. There were wrinkles on his head, and there was more so a feeling of age and death emanating from his body. This was most likely an old man who had already lived for hundreds of millions of years and followed the tranquil heart saint the entire time. However, the lifespan of a small saint was a whopping 1 billion years. Thus, even though this old man belonged to the same generation as the tranquil heart saint, he was already in old age, while the tranquil heart saint was still young and full of vigor. Cultivation was a cruel matter. If one couldn't continue to advance, they would eventually be eroded by age and pass away. Ling Han sighed in emotion as he entered the courtyard. From the outside, the courtyard appeared to be very quaint. However, upon entering, he discovered that there was a whole different world inside. A vast sea appeared before him, and there were countless azure lotuses blossoming in this sea. Each lotus was tens of thousands of meters tall. Before this sea, even ginormous demonic beast would feel minuscule and insignificant. In fact, if one observed this sea from the outside, they would realize that this was simply an ordinary pond that was filled with ordinary lotuses. Transforming a pond into a sea and transforming the lotuses into gigantic azure peaks, this was the action of a saint. Meanwhile, the tranquil heart saint was sitting on a lotus far away in the distance, a fishing rod in his hands. He was clearly hundreds of thousands of kilometers from Ling Han, yet Ling Han could still somehow see him clearly. This wasn't because his vision was incredible, but rather because the tranquil heart saint was like the ruler of this heaven and earth. Ling Han activated the star plucking step and hurried toward the saint. His speed was extraordinary, yet after advancing for a while, he discovered that the distance between him and the tranquil heart saint hadn't decreased at all. In fact, the distance between them had become even greater. He was clearly dashing forward, and the tranquil heart saint clearly hadn't moved. So, why had the distance between them become even greater? Ling Han stopped where he was. He observed his surroundings carefully, and a look of realization eventually appeared on his face. This was a formation. The sea of azure lotuses was in fact a formation. This was a peculiar formation that was constructed from the petals and stems of the lotuses. Ling Han started to observe and resolve the formation. The tranquil heart saint smiled upon seeing this. To discover that he was trapped inside a formation so quickly wasn't an easy feat among all of his disciples. Ling Han could rank inside the top 10. However, discovering and resolving the formation were two completely different matters. In any case, this wasn't a difficult formation, and he wanted to see how long Ling Han would need to resolve it. Yu Susu had spent 6 days, Ren Feiyun had spent 9.5 days, and Cai Miao had spent 10.5 days. The tranquil heart saint was aware that Ling Han possessed extraordinary talent in cultivation. Thus, in the beginning, he hadn't expected for Ling Han to be outstanding in the area of formations. However, while teaching on the public square, he had glanced at Ling Han and been astonished to discover that there were actually 10 formations inscribed inside his body. As someone who cherished talented disciples, he decided to summon Ling Han to his courtyard. He would put some effort into raising Ling Han as long as he could resolve the formation within 20 days. It didn't matter if he wasn't exceptionally talented with formations. He was able to inscribe 10 formations inside his body, after all, so wouldn't this be enough to overcome any deficiency in talent? Ling Han analyzed the formation for 3 days before shaking his head. His foundational knowledge of formations was severely lacking, and thus he would most likely need in excess of 20 days to resolve this formation. However, he understood that this was a test from the tranquil heart saint. Moreover, he didn't know what time limit the tranquil heart saint had in mind. Thus, he was starting to become a little worried. He couldn't genuinely spend 20 days, could he? Moreover, that would be the best-case scenario. Since that was the case, he would use the simplest method: brute force. Chapter 1481 Resolving the Formation Using Brute Strength. Chapter 1481 Resolving the Formation Using Brute Strength. Cultivation could be boiled down to a single notion: those who were more powerful would achieve victory. What did it matter if one didn't understand martial arts techniques or secret technique? As long as they were powerful enough, they could still shatter heavenly bodies, galaxies, or even an entire universe with a single punch. That being the case, Would there still be any unresolvable formations or unbeatable foes in the world? When formation grandmasters resolved formations, they naturally approached it from the perspective of formations. However, Ling Han wasn't a formation grandmaster, and thus he didn't need to be limited by this thinking. He threw a punch at the azure lotus before him. Wang. The azure lotus measured several thousand meters in diameter, and Ling Han's punch sent countless ripples through the surface of the petals of the lotus. The force of his punch was evenly distributed over the entire lotus. With this being the case, Ling Han couldn't cause any damage to the azure lotus. The tranquil heart saint couldn't help but shake his head. Would he have used this formation to examine his disciples if it were so easy to resolve? You should follow the rules and use your knowledge of formations to resolve this formation. However, Ling Han wasn't discouraged. The formation patterns inside his body lit up as he activated all 10 of the killing formations. He then unleashed their power through the lightning sword technique as he slashed at the azure lotus before him. Pu. His attack was far more domineering this time. In fact, even the formation patterns of the lotus were unable to fully dissipate the power of his attack. A gash 3 meters long appeared on the lotus. However, just the size of the lotus that was above the sea already measured tens of thousands of meters in height. Its width was more so several thousand meters in diameter. As such, how effective was a gash of a foot deep and 3 meters long? Moreover, the azure lotus also possessed an extremely powerful recovery ability. In any case, wood element beings were naturally strong in recovery. Azure liquid started to seep out from the wound, quickly healing the gash and forming a scab. The tranquil heart saint sighed in emotion upon seeing this. On one hand, he was quite astonished by what he saw. This was because he was unable to inscribe 10 identical level formations inside his body, even as saint who had achieved his Tao through formations. Moreover, the might that was unleashed by the 10 formations inscribed inside Ling Han's body was truly terrifying. Even he couldn't help but nod in admiration. If he could inscribe 10 formations inside his body, he would definitely be invincible among all of the small saints. This young man was genuinely a supreme prodigy. On the other hand, however, he felt that Ling Han was far too naive to use this kind of brute force method to resolve the ancient azure lotus formation. How could he possibly succeed? This doesn't work, either. Ling Han pondered for a moment before retrieving the divine demon sword. He then slashed at the azure lotus again. Sorry about this. This was a celestial tool, and although its might hadn't been fully unlocked yet, the murderous aura that it released would still be powerful enough to kill whatever it struck. Shua. The formation patterns of the azure lotus were instantly slashed apart by the sword. Murderous aura burst into the surroundings, and the entire azure lotus shuddered before withering at a speed that was visible to the naked eye. The destructive ability of celestial tools was far too terrifying. Although the divine demon sword wasn't a genuine celestial tool yet, this was only the immortal realm, after all. Thus, its attacks were still devastating and fatal. It wasn't long before the azure lotus completely withered and died. Along with it, the formation patterns were naturally destroyed as well. Tranquil heart saint. A string of curses raced through his mind. Ling Han had used the most unlikely method to resolve his formation. The saint couldn't help but feel astonished. At the same time, however, he also wanted to grumble and curse. Fortunately, there weren't any outsiders with him. Otherwise, if he had discussed this ancient azure lotus formation with them, and told them that it would be impossible to resolve with brute strength, he would definitely have had his face slapped right now. What a freakish young man. Upon seeing Ling Han raise his sword and slash at another azure lotus, the tranquil heart saint hurriedly shouted, "Stop, stop, it's extremely difficult for me to nurture even one azure lotus." He reached over and directly grabbed onto Ling Han. He then retracted his arm and tossed Ling Han onto the petal leaf of the azure lotus that he was sitting on. Ling Han plonked onto the lotus leaf. This was clearly a lotus leaf, yet he still felt a sharp pain shoot through his rear. The saint had definitely done this on purpose. "Didn't I just slash one of your lotuses? Is there any need for this? How petty." His expression also mirrored his thoughts. Upon seeing this, the face of the tranquil heart saint almost twisted in anger. Were these azure lotuses ordinary lotuses? These were lotuses that could be inscribed with level 16 formation patterns. As such, they were already nearing the saint level. In fact, they were only a small step away from becoming saintly medicine. He had spent an exorbitant amount of time and effort to nurture these lotuses. In any case, this formation wasn't simply a formation to examine his disciples with. Rather, it also had another much more important use. That was, he could fuse these countless azure lotuses together and transform them into a mother lotus. By doing so, the lotus would break through to level 16 and become a genuine saintly medicine. At that time, he could harvest the lotus heart and have the hardship alchemy saint refine it for him. This lotus heart might then cause the barrier in his cultivation to loosen. If he were lucky, he might even be able to break through to the medium extreme. However, Ling Han had just slashed and killed one of the lotuses. How could he not feel distressed? Even so, there was nothing much that he could say or do. After all, it was he who had invited Ling Han to resolve the formation. Moreover, he hadn't stated that he couldn't use god tools or other items. Thus, he could only swallow this result. Ling Han was probably the first disciple to make a saint feel so gloomy. Ling Han clasped his hands in respect, and said, "Greetings, saint." The tranquil heart saint waved his hand in acknowledgement. He then forcefully suppressed his gloomy emotion, and said, "You've inscribed 10 yin-yang 5-element formations inside your body." "Yes," Ling Han replied with a nod. He knew that he couldn't hide this from the saint. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been summoned by the saint in the first place. "Your bones are truly astonishing," the tranquil heart saint remarked. He couldn't help but praise Ling Han's godly bones. Fortunately, he wasn't aware that the toughness of Ling Han's godly bones would also increase as Ling Han grew stronger. Otherwise, his eyes would become green with envy. He thought the Ling Han's godly bones were only this tough because he had ingested some natural treasure. Ling Han naturally wouldn't explain this to him. He simply nodded, silently accepting the saint's statement. The tranquil heart saint wore a strange expression, and said, "You possess astonishing talent in cultivation, and your physique is also quite unique. Although you're not very talented with formations, you were still able to achieve the notion of using your body as a formation to the extreme. Could it be that his most suitable successor was going to be this amateur in formations? I have high hopes of you," the saint continued. "In half a year, there'll be a competition among all of the newly recruited disciples. If you win this competition, you'll receive saintly origin as a reward." Ling Han's heart thumped in excitement. Saintly origin. This was a precious treasure that was formed when saints used their power of construction to extract the essence of heaven and earth. Saintly origin could elevate one's cultivation, and it could even help with their comprehension. It was indescribably valuable. Even saints would have to pay a huge price if they wanted to refine saintly origin. Thus, they might not even be able to refine a block in several million years. "I must obtain this. I believe this shouldn't be too difficult," Ling Han said with confidence. The tranquil heart saint couldn't help but laugh loudly. However, he immediately shook his head, and said, "You're far too confident. Perhaps you still don't know that Jiyu Dawi has already advanced to the Eternal River tier. Moreover, his battle prowess is incredible. In fact, he can even battle against elites at the high extreme." "Already?" Ling Han was astonished. However, he immediately recalled that Jiyu Dawi had once been a severing mundane tier elite. As such, his cultivation level would naturally rise in a steady manner at least before he reached the severing mundane tier again. There was no way that he would come across any obstructions. Moreover, he also possessed a divine fetus, and thus his growth would naturally be extremely smooth as long as he accumulated enough origin power. Although Ling Han had inscribed 10 killing formations inside his body, the peak of their destructive ability was only on par with the early stage of the high extreme. Thus, it was unclear what the results would be if he were to battle against Jiyu Dawi. He had to advance to the Eternal River tier within half a year. Chapter 1482, Breaking Through to the Eternal River tier. Chapter 1482, Breaking Through to the Eternal River tier. Once he advanced to the Eternal River tier, Ling Han was confident that he would be unrivaled among those at the same cultivation level. Moreover, his godly bones would also advance another level and allow him to inscribe level 15 formations. When 10 identical formations were activated together, his battle prowess would definitely soar to the early stage of the consummate level. Of course, this was only if he chose the most powerful level 15 formations. Otherwise, the 10 formations might only raise his battle prowess to the middle stage of the high extreme. However, there was only half a year for him to prepare, and thus he most likely didn't have enough time to grasp a new formation to inscribe onto his godly bones. He would advance to the Eternal River tier first before worrying about this. He was already trailing Jiu Dawi, and he definitely couldn't slip even further behind. Moreover, many king tiers had only suppressed their cultivation and not broken through in order to fight for the opportunity at the Sunken Abyss Valley. Now that they didn't need to hold back anymore, it was easy to imagine that there would be an explosive increase of new Eternal River tier elites. Long Xiangyue, second in the world, and Hong Ma were all examples of this. Ling Han took his leave from the Tranquil Heart Saint's courtyard. He had received acknowledgement from the Tranquil Heart Saint, and thus he could seek him out and ask for guidance if he had any questions about formations. Of course, the saint wouldn't offer guidance every time Ling Han had a question. This would depend on whether the saint had the time, and also whether he was in the mood. Ling Han immediately entered the Black Tower after arriving back at his residence. He then started to cultivate in seclusion so that he could strive toward the Eternal River tier. In reality, he had already accumulated enough origin power. The only thing he was missing now was comprehension. He started to earnestly comprehend Tao under the reincarnation tree. Countless realizations surfaced in his mind, the universe playing out a scene of birth and destruction and a scene of chaos to order. Countless heavenly bodies dazzled in his mind, their radiance brilliant and unparalleled. Advancing from the heavenly body tier to the Eternal River tier was a significant step. A heavenly body tier cultivator could only wield at most 5 heavenly bodies. Moreover, this was only if they advanced to the pinnacle level. However, Eternal River tier elites would be in control of limitless possibilities. How many heavenly bodies could a Silver River hold? Innumerable. Thus, after advancing to the Eternal River tier, those at the early stage of the low extreme would possess 4 heavenly bodies. Meanwhile, those at the middle stage would possess at least 10, those at the late stage would possess at least 20, and those at the peak stage would possess at least 40. Only after forming 100 heavenly bodies would one be considered to reach the medium extreme. The high extreme would require 1,000 heavenly bodies, while the consummate level would require 10,000 heavenly bodies. Theoretically speaking, Eternal River tier elites could form countless heavenly bodies. Thus, it was even possible that they could surpass the power of saints. This was because a cultivator would have reached the peak stage of the consummate level after forming 100,000 heavenly bodies. At that time, they would have the right to attempt breaking through to the Genesis tier. However, breaking through to the Genesis tier wasn't reliant on the number of heavenly bodies alone. In addition to this, one would also need to comprehend the power of construction. If one couldn't comprehend this, then it would be useless even if they formed 1 million heavenly bodies. It was because of this that there were the strange occurrences of Eternal River tier elites possessing more power than Genesis tier saints. Of course, these Eternal River tier elites would only be more powerful than low-level saints. This was because the power of saints was still derived from the heavenly bodies inside their Silver River. From the base of 100,000 heavenly bodies, they could surge forward and form 500,000 or even 1 million heavenly bodies. However, power wasn't the most important benchmark when considering the strength of a saint. Rather, it was their grasp of the power of construction. If a saint constructed a world, they would be the ruler of that world. Thus, what use would it be regardless of how powerful their opponent was? They wouldn't be able to wield their strength at all. Thus, starting from the Genesis tier, the power of regulations would be superior to just power alone. This was because saints, to some extent, represented heaven and earth. One might possess extraordinary power, but could they be more powerful than the heavens? In fact, it was regarding the power of regulations where the immortal realm and netherworld started to diverge. The former comprehended the power of construction, while the latter comprehended the power of destruction. These were juxtaposing powers, and they were like black to white and fire to water. Ling Han continued to experience all kinds of comprehensions. The sounds of Tao were reverberating inside his body, and his godly bones clanked as if in reply. After an unknown amount of time, a small river suddenly appeared inside his dantian. However, it wasn't water that was flowing through this river. Rather, it was the light of the galaxy. This was an eternal river. His 5 heavenly bodies were immediately absorbed into this river. They continued to glow in the eternal river, and they more so expanded a whopping 100 times in size. This signified that his reserves for origin power had expanded 100-fold. He was immediately struck by an intense feeling of hunger. This wasn't hunger from his stomach, but rather hunger from his heavenly bodies. They were far too empty, and they needed to be fed. Moreover, their food was none other than origin power. Ling Han hurriedly retrieved and ingested a large number of great amplification pills. If they weren't fed enough origin power, these heavenly bodies would start to extract energy from his life force. If his life force were completely consumed, he would be sucked dry and turn into a corpse. With a single mouthful, he ingested over 50 great amplification pills. Only then did his feeling of intense hunger start to subside. After ingesting another dozen or so pills, he finally felt half full. He now needed to face heavenly tribulation. Ling Han exited the Black Tower. In fact, he didn't know how long he had cultivated in seclusion for. If it had been in excess of half a year, then he would have no choice but to accept his bad luck. He strode out of the academy and awaited the arrival of his heavenly tribulation in a barren desert. Boom! Dark clouds formed overhead, arcs of brilliant lightning flashing within them. Come! Ling Han was naturally unafraid. This was only an ordinary heavenly tribulation, and it was far from powerful enough to faze him. He actively shattered his godly bones so that they could be tempered by heavenly tribulation. At the same time, he observed the might of heavenly tribulation so that he could improve his grasp of heaven's might. The heaven's might of this heavenly tribulation was actually weaker than the previous time. Ling Han couldn't help but sigh in emotion. A twofold heavenly tribulation was truly terrifying. He definitely didn't want to experience it again. Half a day passed, and Ling Han circulated a drop of indestructible true fluid. This allowed him to rapidly recover. His godly bones were smooth and crystal-like, and the formation patterns that were inscribed on them also started to reappear. These formation patterns had already become a part of his body. Unless he actively abandoned them, they would reappear with a single thought. I've finally broken through to the eternal river tier. A smile stretched across his face. Hunyo had once said that she would wait several hundred years for him. By the looks of it, she hadn't been exaggerating. He would indeed need to cultivate for several hundred years before he had the right to open the barrier to the celestial realm. He returned to his residence, where Empress Luan Xing and Jiuyao were both waiting for him. He exchanged a glance with Empress Luan Xing, and a smile instantly appeared on both of their faces. They had both broken through to the eternal river tier. Congratulations, Master. Congratulations, Mrs. Jiuyao said. Ling Han nodded in acknowledgement, and said, your cultivation level hasn't lagged behind, either. Not bad. The Star Sand Martial Arts Academy was extremely difficult to enter. However, after entering it, one would be provided with an astonishing amount of resources. With a saint looking over them, what kind of natural treasures couldn't they obtain? Moreover, there was also the hardship alchemy saint who had achieved his Tao through alchemy, a saint who was obsessed with refining pills. Each of the 9 campuses would receive a fair share of the godly medicines that he provided. Jiuyao was already nearing the late stage of the low extreme of the heavenly body tier. His advance was astounding. Of course, this was also because he was sufficiently talented in cultivation. Otherwise, just alchemical pills alone wouldn't have been enough. What day is it? When is the competition between the new disciples? Ling Han asked. Master, you've exited seclusion at just the right time. There are still around 15 days until the competition begins, and we're preparing to head off in 2 days' time, Jiuyao replied. Ling Han nodded in reply. What a coincidental timing. Elites like them might need to undergo comprehension for several years if they were to come across a slightly challenging barrier. However, his advance this time had been surprisingly quick and smooth. It was because of this that he had been able to complete his advance in just half a year's time. If he had come across any barriers, he would have needed several more years to break through. Many people are unhappy with the previous ranking, and they're all fired up to prove themselves in this upcoming competition between new disciples, Empress Luanxing said. Ling Han nodded upon hearing this. Fighting spirit burned in his eyes, and he said, "This time, I'm going to defeat Jiu Dawi fair and square." Chapter 1483, Blossoming of an Old Tree. Chapter 1483, Blossoming of an Old Tree. 2 days passed, and Ling Han along with the other new disciples all set off for the ancient academy under the lead of an Eternal River tier elite. This was only a competition among new disciples, so they naturally wouldn't be led by a saint. After all, would a saint have so much spare time? The so-called ancient academy was, in fact, the genuine Star Sand Martial Arts Academy. This was an academy that was personally created by the Star Sand Saint, and it was also here where he had taught his first cohort of disciples. Afterward, his disciples had gradually founded the 9 large branch campuses. As such, the ancient academy had become a holy land that would only open for grand ceremonies. An example of such an event was the competition between the new disciples. This was an extremely significant event, and thus it was to be held in the ancient academy. In any case, this could also inspire the disciples to greater aspirations and competitiveness. After all, who didn't want to perform well and be able to meet the Star Sand Saint? It was evident that most of them were destined to become stepping stones. Casting one's gaze over the 8th campus, only Ling Han and Empress Luanxing had broken through to the Eternal River tier. This also signified that the others already had no chance. After all, was everyone as powerful as Ling Han and Empress Luanxing? Could they all achieve victory as the underdog? Of course, there were also some who were filled with ambition. They possessed Eternal River tier god tools or perhaps even pseudo-saint tools. With such a pseudo-saint tool in hand, they still had a sliver of chance to achieve victory and become the king of the new disciples. This competition didn't have any rule forbidding the use of god tools or any other tools that exceeded one's own cultivation level. After all, in the outside world, would there be any rule forbidding their opponents from using god tools that exceeded their cultivation level? Because they had set off early, the Eternal River tier elites of the 8th campus hadn't had a chance to prevent Ling Han from leaving, even though they had learned of him coming out of seclusion. They were extremely disappointed, and they had no choice but to await his return. Anyhow, the competition between the new disciples would only run for a dozen days or so. Taking into account the time needed to travel to and from the ancient academy, Ling Han would return to the 8th campus in around a month or so. The 9 campuses were all built around the ancient academy, and they were like a ring of stars guarding a radiant moon. Moreover, the distance between each campus and the ancient academy was also very similar, around 10 days of travel by foot. They were led by Wei Zhan, a teacher of the 8th campus. He was an elite at the peak stage of the consummate level of the Eternal River tier, and thus he would be invincible as long as he didn't come across a Genesis tier saint. Hence, he was naturally unafraid of being attacked by any vicious demonic beasts along the way. 10 days passed, and the 100 new disciples of the 8th campus arrived at the ancient academy. From the outside, the ancient academy appeared even smaller than the 8th campus. In reality, it was indeed smaller than the 8th campus. At that time, the Star Sand Saint hadn't taken many disciples, only taking a dozen or so each time. Thus, there was naturally no need for the ancient academy to be very large. However, the ancient academy definitely couldn't be regarded as small. It was still at least as large as a city. Its main gates were wide open, and there were no soldiers standing guard. This was the holy land of the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy, after all, so who would dare to wantonly enter and cause trouble? The ancient academy wasn't deserted, as a few disciples would receive special permission to come here on a pilgrimage each year. The Star Sand Saint would also show himself occasionally, casually providing some guidance to these lucky disciples. However, just how transcendent were great saints? The words that they uttered were like the sounds of Tao. Thus, even with some casual guidance, the disciples would still see huge and explosive improvements in their cultivation. It was because of this that everyone yearned to come to the ancient academy. However, there were far too few spots, and they would only be able to stay for a year or perhaps even shorter. Moreover, there was no guarantee that they would definitely meet the Star Sand Saint. Ling Han and the others entered the ancient academy. There was naturally someone to greet them and organize their stay. After settling in, the new disciples naturally started to wander about. If they were incredibly fortunate and managed to come across the Star Sand Saint, it was entirely possible that they would attain enlightenment and see a huge improvement in their cultivation, thereby allowing them to stand out from their fellow disciples. Meanwhile, Ling Han started to look for the Rain Emperor and the others. However, most of the campuses hadn't arrived yet, and thus he was only able to find the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden and Ding Ping. The two of them had naturally walked out of the trauma caused by their initiation at the hands of the senior disciples already. However, they still couldn't help but feel extremely indignant when discussing this matter. "We'll exact revenge in the future," Ling Han said to the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden in consolation. As for Ding Ping, Ling Han naturally ignored him. After all, since when would a master console their disciple? If Ding Ping weren't resilient enough, would he still have the right to be his disciple? Ding Ping was naturally left speechless. Right now, they had all transitioned to practicing the cultivation technique that Ling Han had given them. This cultivation technique could take them all the way to the peak stage of the Genesis tier. However, after reaching the Genesis tier, this cultivation technique could only act as a guide. The main stimulus for their advance would still be their own comprehension. However, the advantage of high-level cultivation techniques was still extremely evident, especially for cultivators under the Genesis tier. Only a year had passed, yet the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden and Ding Ping had both seen huge improvements. After all, the Martial Arts Academy also provided them with a generous amount of resources. In fact, it could be said that it was an extravagant amount of resources. Ling Han and the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden were extremely delighted to see each other again, and thus Ding Ping and Jiuyao were naturally shooed aside by them. The two of them acted all lovey-dovey as they expressed their love for each other. Of course, it was inevitable that they would also make love with each other. Only after satisfying their desires did they hold hands and start to stroll around the ancient academy. Go, go, go. The shouts of a child traveled over as two people appeared before them. One of them was a young man, and he was currently crawling along the ground on all fours. Meanwhile, a little boy of around 4 or 5 years old was riding on his back and shouting in excitement. Ling Han was astonished. The young man was at the heavenly body tier, while the little boy was only at the shattering void tier. It was most likely because the little boy's bloodline was powerful that he possessed such a cultivation level at such a young age. In fact, he had probably been born with this cultivation level. In any case, this little boy was far too spoiled. The heavenly body tier elite was willing to get down on all fours and pretend to be a horse, so the little boy was most certainly his own child. This was their own family matter, so Ling Han naturally wouldn't poke his nose in. He held on to the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden's hand and was just about to walk away. However, the little boy suddenly pointed over and shouted, "I want to ride that big sister." If this weren't a little boy, Ling Han would have definitely slapped them silly already. However, this was a child's babble, so he naturally wouldn't pay much heed. He pretended that he hadn't heard. "You're not allowed to leave," the little boy shouted willfully. He forcefully dug his heel into the horse's ribs, urging it to dash forward and block the path of Ling Han and the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden. Ling Han frowned upon seeing this. It was normal for children to be playful and mischievous. However, this little boy was taking things too far. Was his father not going to stop him? However, the young man who was playing horse suddenly crawled up and lifted the little boy into his arms. He then dashed before Ling Han and said, "You heard young Master Yun's request, didn't you? Now hurry up and do as he said." "Huh? This young man isn't that little boy's father. Young Master Yun." Even a heavenly body tier cultivator is referring to him as young master, So this little boy definitely possesses a powerful background, right? Ling Han's expression darkened, and he said, "It's your right to act like a horse or cow and lick the boots of others. However, if you continue to annoy me, don't blame me for becoming angry. I want to ride a horse. I want to ride a horse," the little boy wailed. He was as willful as could be. "Yes, yes, yes, young master, just wait for a little moment longer." The young man comforted the little boy before turning back around to face Ling Han and the heavenly phoenix divine maiden. There was a haughty look on his face. This was an expression of indescribable superiority. "Do you know who young Master Yun is?" Ling Han shook his head, and replied, "I genuinely don't know." However, he knew that this little boy definitely possessed an astonishing background. Otherwise, how could a heavenly body tier cultivator be willing to bend his back and play horse? "Young Master Yun," the young man purposefully paused to add to the suspense before finally saying, "Young Master Yun is the son and only child of the Star Sand Saint. Pu." Ling Han instantly choked and spluttered upon hearing this. He then broke into a fit of coughing. He was genuinely shocked. He wasn't shocked by the little boy's identity, but rather by the fact that his father was the Star Sand Saint. After all, just how old was the Star Sand Saint? Yet, he had actually become parent to such a young child. The Star Sand Saint was truly old but still vigorous. This was the blossoming of an old tree. The old man had not only married a young woman, but he had even had a child with her. Chapter 1484, Scolding. Chapter 1484, Scolding. How old was the Star Sand Saint? Theoretically speaking, a great saint could live for 3 billion years. However, saints would have to overcome an immortal's calamity every 100 million years. If they couldn't overcome this, they would have a portion of their lifespan severed. In fact, it was even possible that they might be directly killed. Even in the celestial realm where one would possess an unlimited lifespan after reaching the severing mundane tier, one would still be riddled with stubborn illnesses if they were unable to overcome their immortal's calamity. Eventually, these elites would pass away. Thus, it wasn't certain that the Star Sand Saint could live for a full 3 billion years. Even if he could, he was already nearing that age anyway. It was widely rumored that the Star Sand Saint was already approaching the end of his life. It was also because of this that he was urgently trying to find a successor to his inheritance. Although he had raised 9 saints, none of them were capable of truly inheriting his Tao. The reason for this was simple. To say nothing of becoming a great saint, none of the 9 saints had even advanced to become a medium saint. However, this old man who already had half his body inside a coffin had actually become the parent of a little boy of only 4 or 5 years old. This was astonishing. Ling Han was fully aware of how difficult it was for powerful cultivators to conceive a child. He had made love with both Shui Yenyu and the heavenly phoenix divine maiden many times, yet he couldn't get them pregnant no matter what. This was because the more powerful a cultivator became, the more condensed their essence would become. As a result, it would be extremely difficult for them to have children. This was a backlash from heaven and earth. The more one absorbed from heaven and earth, the more powerful the backlash from heaven and earth would be. Not to mention a great saint like the Star Sand Saint, it was already extremely difficult for even ordinary saints to have children. Moreover, the Star Sand Saint was already nearing the end of his lifespan. How impressive! Ling Han was slightly stunned. This old bull was truly impressive. Not only was he still working hard, but his hard work had even produced a fruit. One could genuinely treat him as a role model. Upon seeing the dazed expression on Ling Han's face, the young man thought that he had frightened him. He sneered, and said, "Now that you're aware of young Master Yun's identity, hurry up and kneel down to greet him." This young man was Mo Li, and he was a disciple of the 7th campus. He had been extremely fortunate, and he had won the opportunity to come to the ancient academy on a pilgrimage. In a stroke of coincidence, he had run across this little boy. After learning of his identity, he had tried everything in his abilities to grow closer to him. He eventually succeeded, and he was now the little boy's playmate. As long as he rode on this little boy's coattails, he would naturally have some opportunity to eventually meet the Star Sand Saint. At that time, he would soar into the sky. Ling Han shook his head, and said, "I've come here to cultivate, not to become someone's slave. Children might be ignorant, but are you also this ignorant? If you dare to spew any more nonsense, I'm not afraid to beat you up." "You dare!" Mowgli shouted. What an absolute joke. Young Master Yoon was present, and even the 9 saints would have to respectfully refer to him as little brother if they were here. So, would an ordinary disciple like Ling Han dare to cause any trouble? "I want to ride a horse. I want to ride a horse." Meanwhile, the little boy continued to cause a ruckus. As he yelled, he also continued to kick Mowgli's stomach. Of course, this naturally couldn't hurt a heavenly body tier cultivator. However, Mowgli had to carefully control his origin power such that he wouldn't accidentally counterattack on instinct after being attacked by the little boy. Otherwise, the little boy would be insta-killed by him. If that were to happen, things would truly become chaotic. Ling Han shook his head upon seeing this. With such a pathetic mindset, did this young man have any right to become an elite? Since he had been able to enter the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy, this young man was definitely a king tier. However, it was a shame that being a king tier in the past didn't guarantee that one would remain a king tier forever. It was evident that he had already fallen. He wanted to take a shortcut, yet he didn't realize that he had already lost what was most important to a cultivator: dignity and belief. "Let's go." Ling Han wrapped his arm around the heavenly phoenix divine maiden's waist as he turned around to leave. He had no time for this nonsense. "You're trying to escape." Mowgli was enraged, and he instantly charged over and launched a punch at Ling Han's back. Only when his fist was about to strike Ling Han's back did he shout, "Eat my fist." Ling Han humphed as he reached backward in a clawing motion. He had acted later, yet his strike had arrived first. His hand wrapped around Mowgli's neck. Before an Eternal River tier elite, especially a freakish rank 3 king tier like Ling Han, what threat could a heavenly body tier cultivator pose? Upon entering the academy, Ling Han had already been powerful enough to rival elites at the low extreme of the Eternal River tier. Thus, if he were challenged by a heavenly body tier cultivator, just how freakishly powerful would that heavenly body tier cultivator have to be? "You're asking for a beating." Ling Han's right hand started to shudder as bursts of origin power coursed through it. At the same time, creaking and cracking sounds started to travel out from Mowgli's body. This was the sound of his bones colliding against each other. Mowgli didn't possess a powerful physique, so Ling Han's brutal attack caused at least half of his bones to break. He screamed in agony as his face instantly became twisted with pain. However, he was quite stubborn, and he didn't beg Ling Han to stop. Instead, he shouted, "You dared to wound me? You actually dared to wound me? Humph! Even a god can't save you now. I'll say that you tried to ambush and attack young Master Yoon. You're dead meat." There was a menacing glint in his eyes as he stared at Ling Han. In this academy, no disciple dared to kill a fellow disciple. This was because they would have to pay with their own life. Thus, the power was now in Mowgli's hands. He had only become wounded because he was trying to protect young Master Yoon. Meanwhile, Ling Han had actually tried to assassinate young Master Yoon. His fate could only be death. Ling Han couldn't help but chuckle. He slapped the young man's face before saying, "Who would have thought that you actually had some brains? However, it's a shame that you haven't put your mind to the right task. Otherwise, you would have broken through to the Eternal River tier long ago." Mowgli was slightly astonished. Why wasn't Ling Han afraid? This wasn't right. In his mind, this was a deadly situation. Unless Ling Han begged him to change his mind, it was inevitable that he would be severely punished. Logically speaking, Ling Han should have been shuddering in fright. He should have immediately lowered his head to beg for his life. So, how was he still so calm and composed? Perhaps he possessed a terrifying background that could rival the Star Sand Saint. Impossible. If that were the case, why would he even come here? Ling Han smiled as he pointed in the direction of the heavenly phoenix divine maiden. He then said, "Look over there." Mowgli looked over, and he was instantly stunned by what he saw. Young Master Yoon was happily playing with that woman. Moreover, that woman hadn't kneeled down to act like a horse or cow, either. Instead, she was simply carrying the little boy in her arms, a doting look on her face. This. Something like this is possible? Mo Li wanted to vomit blood. The plan that he had viewed as flawless was easily shattered just like that. Moreover, the person who had ruined his plan was none other than young Master Yoon, the little boy whom he had obsequiously played with for several months. This was a painful realization. Be an upright and dignified person. Since you were able to enter the academy, you were definitely a king tier in the past. Why choose this kind of stray path? Ling Han roared. His voice was like the thought-provoking evening drums and morning bell. Mo Li fell deep into thought. How ambitious had he been in the past? However, he had suffered the initiation of being forced to crawl through a dog flap on the first day of entering the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy. Afterward, he had put all of his effort into cultivating, resulting in his cultivation level rising rapidly. However, the Star Sand Martial Arts Academy was brimming with king tiers, and he had suffered several more brutal losses. This severely dented his self-confidence. As a result, he started to take stray and crooked paths, no longer keeping his focus on martial arts. What am I aiming for? What should I aim for? Mo Li shuddered upon thinking of this. Clarity returned to his eyes, and an expression of remorse appeared on his face. Since he was a king tier, his mindset was naturally outstanding. A sudden realization was enough to change his entire life. I understand. He nodded, and said, Senior brother, if Mo Li becomes successful in the future, it will all be thanks to your words today. Ling Han smiled, and said, Farewell. Then, young Master Yoon, Mo Li looked toward the little boy. This was the child of a great saint, after all, so who could shoulder the responsibility if anything untoward were to happen? Rest assured, I'll return him home safely, Ling Han said with a nod. Mo Li hesitated for a moment before saying, Senior brother, young Master Yoon's mother is extremely haughty. Be careful not to anger her. He lowered his voice when saying this as if he were afraid of anyone else hearing. Young Master Yoon's mother, that was the wife of the great saint. Chapter 1485 I want to take her as my wife. Chapter 1485 I want to take her as my wife. This was the wife of a great saint, and she had just given birth to his son and only child, no less. Thus, it wouldn't be surprising if she were slightly more arrogant and haughty. Ling Han nodded, and said, Then we won't enter. We'll drop him off from a distance and let him return by himself. Although the child was only 4 or 5 years old, he had already broken through to the shattering void tier. As such, would he be afraid of tripping over and hurting himself? In any case, this was ancient academy. Even though the Star Sand Saint was always cultivating in seclusion, he would definitely still have a wisp of his divine sense looking over his precious son at all times. Under such circumstances, how could anything happen to him? After pondering for a moment, Mo Li felt that Ling Han's words were correct. He immediately stood up and used his origin power to stabilize his bones. He then gritted his teeth as he suppressed his pain and left. There was cold sweat dripping down his forehead, yet he didn't cry out in pain. In his eyes, this was a very valuable experience. He would remember this day forever, and he would never forget the original intentions that had led him down this path of Tao. The little boy was only 4 or 5 years old, and thus he couldn't be overly immoral regardless of how spoiled he was. With some playful encouragement from the heavenly phoenix divine maiden, he quickly started to giggle, quickly forgetting about his desire to ride on her back. Ling Han walked over, and said, Let's bring him home. Millimeter. The heavenly phoenix divine maiden nodded in agreement before turning to Ling Han and saying, I also want a child. Her eyes were as limpid as water, and there was a look of intoxicating seductiveness within them. Ling Han's heart fluttered, and he said, Then let's leave this brat here and head off to make some monkeys. The heavenly phoenix divine maiden rolled her eyes at him. How could he say this before such a young child? Although such a young child definitely wouldn't understand. I want to ride on a monkey. The little boy understood the word monkey, and he immediately started to shout in excitement. Ling Han casually waved a hand and retrieved a demonic beast from the Black Tower. This demonic beast was much like a monkey, apart from the pair of wings on its back. This was a flying monkey. The demonic beast was aggressive, and it immediately bared its teeth upon arriving before them. Moreover, it could determine the strength of the 3 people before it, so it directed all of its aggressiveness toward the weakest young boy. Although the little boy already possessed a very impressive cultivation level, he was still extremely young, after all. He was given a huge fright by the sudden appearance of the monkey, and he immediately started to bawl. "We're meant to be bringing him back home, not scaring him," the heavenly phoenix divine maiden said. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. At the same time, she thought to herself that she definitely couldn't allow Ling Han to raise their child, whenever she managed to give birth to one. He was far too casual. After spending great effort to cheer up the little boy, the 2 of them continued to lead him home. After all, he possessed a sensitive identity, so there would definitely be trouble if he went missing for too long. "I want to ride a horse. I want to ride a horse." After a short while, the little boy started to repeat his previous request again. His attitude was extremely aggressive. He was already accustomed to being spoiled, and thus he was insistent on getting anything that he desired. If he didn't obtain what he wanted, he would simply start to cry. Once he started to cry, he would definitely have his wish fulfilled. This tactic had never failed before. Ling Han tossed the flying monkey before him again, saying, "Here, ride it." The monkey bared its teeth, a fierce look on its face. The little boy couldn't help but plonk to the ground in fright. However, he didn't cry this time. Instead, his face had gone pale with fright. "Why you? He's still a child. Is there any need to frighten him like this?" The heavenly phoenix divine maiden hurriedly helped the little boy up. Ling Han scratched his head upon hearing this. He was accustomed to dealing with adults, whom he could reason with. If they didn't understand reason, he would then employ force. However, this was just a spoiled little brat. If both reason and threats failed, he would be at a complete loss for what to do. The heavenly phoenix divine maiden waved a hand at him, and said, "Don't say anything else." She deprived him of the right to look after this child. Ling Han couldn't help but sigh. He was a cultivation genius, and he was also the alchemy emperor. Moreover, he also possessed outstanding talent in the field of formations. It could be said that he was an extraordinary prodigy. However, there was no perfect person, and there were also areas in which he was poor. If there were anything to blame, it would be that he had spent far too little time with his own son. Thus, he had absolutely no experience when it came to children. In any case, Hunyo became jealous far too easily. Otherwise, he would have Helian Xuanxue to his left, Shui Yenyu to his right, and the heavenly phoenix maiden behind him. In his embrace would be the empress. If that were the case, how joyous would his life be? "I have to cultivate harder and strive to enter the celestial realm as soon as possible. Otherwise, my wives and son won't even recognize me in the future." It was only natural that the little boy was a very poor guide. As such, it took them a long time and many wrong turns before they finally arrived before a peaceful and serene courtyard. This was the little boy's home. Before Ling Han could even knock, he heard a creak as the gate slowly swung open. An old man of around 70 years old walked out from the courtyard. Both his hair and eyebrows were white, yet he wasn't hunchbacked in the least. He was dressed in a jade robe, and it looked like he was the housekeeper of a prestigious family. However, it was indeed true that few families in the world could hire a housekeeper such as him. This was an eternal river tier elite, and his cultivation level was even higher than that of Ling Han's. However, Ling Han couldn't determine whether he was at the medium extreme, high extreme, or consummate level. "Young Master Yun." The old man wore a beaming smile as he reached her arms toward the little boy. However, the little boy didn't give him any face at all. He immediately turned around to wrap his arms around the heavenly phoenix divine maiden's neck instead. He didn't want to be embraced by the old man. "We've brought him back home, so let's take our leave now." Ling Han nodded toward the heavenly phoenix divine maiden, signifying for her to let go of the little boy. After receiving Mo Li's warning, he didn't want to meet the wife of the great saint at all. He wasn't curious in the least. However, even though the heavenly phoenix divine maiden had already squatted down, the little boy still wasn't willing to let go of her neck. "Don't leave. Don't leave. I want to take you as my wife," he shouted. Ling Han couldn't help but grimace. This little brat dared to steal his wife. The heavenly phoenix divine maiden smiled, and said, "Be a good boy, little Yoon. Come on, let go of my neck. No, I want to take you as my wife. We can sleep together at night," the little boy continued to shout. Ling Han's expression darkened. Meanwhile, the heavenly phoenix divine maiden giggled, and said, "But big sister is already someone else's wife. I don't care. I want to take you as my wife." The little boy continued to cause a ruckus as he held onto the heavenly phoenix divine maiden's neck. The old man smiled, and said, "Since this is the case, why don't you stay here for a while, young lady? When young Master Yoon grows tired of you, you'll naturally be able to leave." Ling Han was extremely displeased upon hearing this. He could treat children's words as a joke since they were just children, after all. However, this was an old man, so didn't he understand how to respect others? What did he mean that she could leave after his young master grew tired of her? Was he treating her as a fellow human being? "We're incredibly busy, and we have no time to look after a child," he said calmly. "Young man, young Master Yoon is the son of the great saint," the old man replied calmly, not becoming angry at Ling Han's words. "My wife is also the child of her parents. What, do we owe you something?" Ling Han's voice was cold and aggressive. The old man chuckled, and said, "Even if young Master Yoon wants the sun in the sky, this old man will still do everything within his ability to obtain it for him. Not to mention, his current request is extremely easy to satisfy." He extended his arms toward the heavenly phoenix divine maiden as he spoke, and it was clear that he wanted to capture her and drag her into the courtyard. Humph! Ling Han immediately threw a punch at him. This punch was imbued with a tremendous sword chi. He had lashed out later than the old man, yet his lightning sword technique was astonishingly quick, reaching the old man before he could grab onto the heavenly phoenix divine maiden. His punch instantly collided with the old man's hand. Wang! A powerful shock wave instantly surged into the surroundings. If it weren't for the saint-level defensive formation around the courtyard, their exchange would have definitely obliterated the entire courtyard. Huh! There was a look of astonishment on the old man's face. This young man had actually blocked his attack. Although he had only struck out casually, he was an elite at the peak stage of the high extreme. As such, how could a junior who had just advanced to the Eternal River tier defend against him? Chapter 1486, Returning Kindness with Hatred. Chapter 1486, Returning Kindness with Hatred. "Wife, let's go," Ling Han said solemnly. It was clear that he was already extremely displeased at this moment. The heavenly phoenix divine maiden nodded as she placed the little boy down. If a heavenly body tier elite wanted to break free, how could someone at the shattering void tier stop them? The little boy started to pout, a look of sadness on his face. He then suddenly turned around and sprinted into the courtyard. There were tears streaking down his face, and he screamed, "Mom! Mom! Mom!" Great, he was crying for his mother now. "You can't leave until young Master Yoon gives you permission to do so," the old man said balefully. He released his heavenly bodies, which spread throughout the sky like a heavenly river. These heavenly bodies were incredibly radiant, and there were 9,999 of them in total. He was at the peak stage of the high extreme of the Eternal River tier, and he was just a step away from advancing to the consummate level. However, this was an incredibly challenging barrier, and it would be astonishingly difficult to condense the 10,000th heavenly body. Perhaps he wouldn't be able to condense this heavenly body even if he lived for 10 more lifetimes. In any case, each of the heavenly bodies surrounding him was brilliant and dazzling. Moreover, they all exuded a powerful aura that was unique to Eternal River tier elites. This aura was extremely close to being able to resonate with heaven and earth. Compared to this, Ling Han's measly 5 heavenly bodies appeared to be incredibly shabby. There was a huge gulf between both their cultivation level and power. They were on 2 completely different levels. Moreover, even if Ling Han's power could surpass 6 stars, that would still only elevate his power to the late stage of the medium extreme. Meanwhile, even if the old man weren't a 1-star genius, the difference in their power would still be a whopping 5 stars. Although power wasn't a complete representation of battle prowess, such a huge gulf would still give the old man a crushing advantage. Before such formidable power, What use were techniques and skills? Not to mention, the huge gulf between their cultivation levels also meant that the old man was planets ahead of Lin Han when it came to their grasp of the regulations of heaven and earth. Ling Han's power simply couldn't compare to that of the old man. In fact, he didn't even possess the right to challenge him. The heavenly phoenix divine maiden stepped back, giving Ling Han space so that he could battle without any worries. I've come to realize that the conscience of many people has been swallowed by dogs. We brought the little boy back in a gesture of goodwill, yet this is how you treat us. If everyone is like you, who would still dare to offer gestures of goodwill in the future? Ling Han said calmly, "Old geezer, if you fall over one day, and no one comes over to help you, letting you slowly rot on the ground, how would you feel?" The old man was instantly enraged. What was his cultivation level? Would he not be able to get up if he fell over? The tongue of this brat was far too toxic. He was actually cursing him to die. This world is fair. That is, those who are powerful are kings, the old man said coldly. Since you want to twist the facts, I have no choice but to subdue you with force. Fighting spirit exploded from Ling Han's body as he tore through the old man's sea of heavenly bodies. You still had yet to be born when I was commanding the sea and waves. The old man lashed out again, several hundred dazzling heavenly bodies on his palm. He didn't need to unleash his full power. Were several hundred heavenly bodies not enough to suppress a cultivator at the low extreme of the eternal river tier? It was a shame that he hadn't witnessed Ling Han's heavenly bodies. Those were heavenly bodies that were several hundred times larger than those of ordinary eternal river tier elites. As such, Ling Han's 5 heavenly bodies could be wielded as if they were 500. That being the case, how could he be suppressed by a mere several hundred heavenly bodies? Ling Han didn't activate the yin-yang 5-element formation. Instead, he simply replied with a casual punch. The two of them exchanged another strike. However, the commotion this time was far greater than the last. In fact, even the space surrounding them was violently torn apart. If someone were to wander into this area, their body would be instantly torn into countless shreds. The heavenly phoenix divine maiden had already retreated sufficiently far enough, yet she was still pushed several hundred meters back upon being struck by the shock wave of their exchange. Only after retreating into a huge boulder was she able to stop and stabilize herself. Ling Han retracted his fist and clasped his hands behind his back, calmly saying, "The young are gradually overtaking the old now. It's time for you to retire and enjoy the last moments of your life." The old man couldn't help but feel astonished. He couldn't underestimate this young man any longer. After all, his power was already nearing the peak stage of the medium extreme. He chuckled strangely, and said, "Young man, your power is indeed extraordinary. It's no wonder that you were able to enter the academy. However, this old man is at the peak stage of the high extreme of the eternal river tier." As he said this, he lashed out for the 3rd time. This time, however, all of the heavenly bodies around him lit up, unleashing a vast and seemingly boundless power. He was unleashing his full strength. In reality, Ling Han could choose to face this attack head-on. Even if he didn't channel the indestructible Heaven's Scroll, his physique had already surpassed the toughness of level 14 godly metal, and was nearing the toughness of level 15 godly metal. Thus, he could face the attack of an elite at the high extreme of the eternal river tier head-on. However, he hadn't come here to suffer a beating. He made a pointing motion, and the 10 killing formations inside his body instantly started to circulate, transforming into cold and vicious killing intent. This killing intent then intertwined with his sword chi as it slashed at the old man. Shua. This was sword chi that had simply been unleashed from his fingers, yet it was dazzling and formidable as it soared into the skies. Peng. Ling Han was pushed several hundred meters back before he was finally able to stabilize his body. It was clear that his power was still lacking. However, his physique was far too freakish, and thus he didn't even spit blood after being struck by this overwhelming shockwave. Meanwhile, the old man groaned in pain. Raising his hand, he more so found that there was blood seeping from the webbing of his hand. During their exchange just then, it had appeared as if Ling Han had suffered greater damage. However, in reality, it was the old man who had suffered more. The reason for this was simple. Ling Han's skin was far too thick. Good one, brat. The old man's beard and hair all stood on ends as a look of anger spread across his face. He was incandescent with rage. How many years had it been? When was the last time he had suffered such damage? Ling Han stood tall and proud before him. The indestructible Heaven Scroll had always been incredibly effective when it came to defensive ability. Now that he had combined it with the power of formations, he was finally able to elevate his offensive ability to a formidable level as well. In the Celestial Realm, Ding Yarolong was able to challenge elites 2 minor levels above him simply because he had grasped Tide of the Ages. However, could Tide of the Ages compare to the indestructible Heaven's Scroll? It wouldn't make sense if Ling Han couldn't challenge elites who were 2 or 3 minor levels above him. In the past, Ling Han had only been missing a trigger. Now that he had finally learned how to use his body as a formation, it was as if he had been given wings. His power had soared to a new height. Moreover, this was in light of the fact that he had only just broken through, and not had the time to swap his formations out for a level 15 killing formation. Otherwise, upon circulating his 10 killing formations, he could even kill elites at the peak stage of the high extreme. The old man suddenly shuddered at this moment. This wasn't out of fright. Rather, it was because he had activated all of his chi and blood. Those at the low extreme of the Eternal River tier had a lifespan of 100 million years. Meanwhile, those at the high extreme had a lifespan of 300 million years. Of course, these were the limits under the most ideal situations. In reality, most elites couldn't enjoy such a long life. Thus, during the latter stages of their life, cultivators would definitely exert strict control over their blood and chi, preventing them from being overly consumed. Only by maintaining this strict control would they be able to live to the limit of their lifespan. This old man was already nearing the tail end of his life. Thus, during ordinary times, his blood and chi would be in a deep slumber. This was to prevent excess consumption. However, his opponent at this moment was far too powerful, so he had no choice but to activate his blood and chi. This was destined to be an intense and dazzling battle. Otherwise, it was very likely that he would be defeated by this young man. Boom! A terrifying aura erupted from his body, enveloping him in a divine halo. It was as if he were a god who had just descended into this world. This was the true power of an elite at the high extreme of the Eternal River tier. Good boy, don't cry. Mom will definitely bring your wife back for you. At this moment, a voice suddenly traveled out from within the courtyard. Immediately afterward, a woman appeared at the gate of the courtyard, a little boy in her arms. The old man had still been like a ferocious lion just then, yet he immediately retracted his aura at this moment. He respectfully kneeled down, saying, "Greetings, madam." Ling Han sighed in his mind. He hadn't wanted to meet the wife of the great saint, yet he had still ended up coming across her. He turned around to face her. She was a beautiful woman, though her beauty wasn't breathtaking and worthy of sacrificing cities for. At the very least, the beauty of the heavenly phoenix divine maiden was streets ahead of her. "You dare to remain standing after seeing me?" Upon seeing Ling Han, the woman immediately turned her attention away from her bawling son. A look of anger flashed across her face. Chapter 1487 Unreasonable. Chapter 1487 Unreasonable. This woman was only at the medium extreme of the heavenly body tier. Moreover, she had only just broken through to this level, so her aura was extremely unstable. This woman was truly arrogant and haughty. Even the tranquil heart saint and the other saints didn't require others to kneel before them in greeting. Yet, this woman was actually furious that he hadn't kneeled before her. In fact, she was so furious that she was even ignoring her son now. Just as Mo Li had warned, this woman had an extremely bad temper. In any case, this was easy to understand. Although the Star Sand Saint was the most powerful being in the hundreds of nearby galaxies, he was already nearing the end of his lifespan. In fact, he was old enough to be the ancestor of the ancestor of the ancestor of this woman. However, the two of them had still ended up together. If she hadn't been attracted by wealth and fame, how could she have ended up with this kind of senile old man? The Star Sand Martial Arts Academy was brimming with young king tiers, So could she not have found an outstanding man to accompany her for the rest of her life? This was definitely a scheming woman. Otherwise, there was no way she could have enticed a great saint to marry her at such an old age. Not only that, but they had even had a son together. Perhaps this was her aim. No one would dare to target her and risk offending the Star Sand Saint. In any case, how had this woman managed to enter a relationship with the Star Sand Saint? Perhaps no one knew the answer to this question. However, it was almost a certainty that she had been extremely obedient and well-behaved in the beginning. Otherwise, there was simply no way that she could have attracted the Star Sand Saint. However, immediately after becoming his wife and especially after giving birth to their son, she started to show her true colors. You're still not kneeling? The woman glowered at Ling Han, a haughty expression on her face. She indeed possessed the right to be haughty. She was the wife of a great saint, and it could be said that she was one of the most powerful beings in the hundreds of nearby galaxies. As such, what did she need to be afraid of? She could act in a haughty manner now, and as the master's wife of the 9 saints, she could still act like this even after the Star Sand Saint passed away. The 9 saints would still have to treat her with utmost respect. After all, respect for one's master was incredibly important to cultivate. 7 saints wouldn't dare to challenge this notion. Otherwise, they would be criticized and condemned by the world. Ling Han clasped his hands and respectfully said, "Greetings, madam." The woman was naturally unsatisfied by this. She looked to the side and said, "Zhong Jian." The old man hurriedly stood up and respectfully said, "This old servant is here." "Capture this audacious person," the woman commanded. "Mom, I want to take her as my wife," the little boy in her arm shouted as he pointed at the heavenly phoenix divine maiden. "Did you hear young master's request?" the woman asked. The old man wiped the sweat from his brows and replied, "This old servant understand." He activated his blood and chi again. Boom. His vitality rose explosively. However, there were already few chances for him to experience such vitality ever again. His blood and chi were already nearly exhausted, and he was forcefully activating and combusting them at this moment. Thus, he naturally couldn't use this technique many more times. Right now, however, he was genuinely an elite at the peak stage of the high extreme of the Eternal River tier. His battle prowess was off the chart. He lashed out, a gigantic Tao manifestation appearing behind him as his thousands of large heavenly bodies orbited around his body. This Tao manifestation looked indomitable, measuring at least tens of thousands of meters in height. Mimicking the old man's movements, this Tao manifestation also launched a strike at Ling Han. Ling Han's expression became serious. With a roar, he unsheathed his divine demon sword and activated the 10 killing formations inside his body. He then activated the lightning sword technique and unleashed his most powerful attack. The lightning sword technique had become even more terrifying now. Fused with the power of Tide of the Ages, Heaven's Might, and his killing formations, it could definitely be considered as the most powerful sword technique of the immortal realm. It was only due to the limits of Ling Han's cultivation level that the lightning sword technique was still unable to reach its pinnacle power. Go! The sword slashed down, intent on ripping open a bright and clear sky even if it were faced with a vast expanse of chaos. Shua! There was a flash of sword light, and the large hand of the Tao manifestation was instantly obliterated into nothingness. Clear skies reappeared behind him. The old man groaned in pain. A wound had appeared on his right hand. This was caused by the backlash of the Tao manifestation. Fortunately, it was only his Tao manifestation that had been struck. Otherwise, his situation would have definitely been direr if he'd been the one struck by the divine demon sword. He would have needed to sever his entire hand in order to prevent the murderous aura of the divine demon sword from entering his body. If he didn't, he might lose his entire arm or even be killed. The woman was astonished. Zhong Jian had actually failed to defeat Ling Han. She was unclear about Ling Han's cultivation level, but she knew that Zhong Jian was an elite at the peak stage of the high extreme. Yet, he was still unable to suppress Ling Han. Gasp! She was naturally familiar with those who came here on a pilgrimage. With her vanity, she would definitely have these people kneel down to greet her. Thus, She was certain that Ling Han was a new student who had come here to participate in the competition. A new student can also be this powerful? Trash, the woman spat in disdain as she glowered at the old man. She then chided, hurry up and piss off. The old man didn't dare to speak back. All he could do was suppress his blood and chi and obediently step back. In fact, he had only suffered a slight disadvantage in his exchange with Ling Han. He was still far from being defeated. After all, unless Ling Han used the Nine Heavens flame, that had already been his most powerful attack. Even so, he had only managed to leave a small gash on the old man's hand. It was evident just how powerful the old man was. The woman walked forward with the little boy in her arms. She then peered down at Ling Han with a haughty expression, and said, "Your skills are quite impressive. I'll make an exception for you and take you as my servant. Hurry up and thank my benevolence." Ling Han was astonished. Was she dropped on her head as a child? She wants me to thank her for taking me as her servant. What a dumb C*nt. He shook his head, and said, "No one in the world can force me to become their servant." "I disagree," the woman said as she twirled a lock of her hair. "You might be stubborn now, but I naturally have ways to make you lower your head." What a joke. She was the wife of the great saint, and she was more so the master's wife to the 9 saints. With such a background, could she not force this measly eternal river tear cultivator to lower his head? Ling Han chuckled before turning around to leave. He was truly unfortunate to have come across this kind of ill-tempered woman. No, he couldn't swallow her insults like this. He had to seek out the large black dog and have him mess with this woman. Mom, I want my wife. I want my wife." The little boy was still sobbing, yet the woman paid no heed to his wails. Right now, all she wanted to do was to force Ling Han to lower his head. She needed to prove her might as the wife of the great saint. After experiencing this, Ling Han and the heavenly phoenix divine maiden weren't in the mood to wander around anymore. They returned to their residence together. 3 days passed, and the students from the 9 campuses had all arrived. The competition was about to begin. Everyone drew lots, deciding who they would battle against. The losers would be eliminated. However, the top-ranked seeds such as Ling Han and Jiu Daoi were all divided into the 16 different brackets. This way, they wouldn't come across each other until the final group of 16. The competition began, and everyone wanted to make a name for themselves. Each battle was of utmost importance, and each competitor fought with their full power. All kinds of secret techniques were unleashed, and high-level god tools also appeared one after another. There were many cases of underdogs emerging as the final victor. If they possessed a god tool or saint tool, those at the heavenly body tier could also unleash a battle prowess that was on par with the eternal river tier. Thus, if their opponents weren't at the eternal river tier, or if they didn't also possess a god tool, they would naturally suffer defeat. However, Ling Han didn't come across any such opponent. He won the first battle with ease, and it was much the same for the second battle. At this moment, the number of competitors had already been reduced to just 225 people. They drew lots again. 31 people had no opponent, and could thus automatically advance to the next round. After this round, the number of competitors would be further reduced to just 128 people. At that time, there would be no weak competitors remaining. They would all be rank 2 or rank 3 king tiers. Meanwhile, most rank 2 king tiers possessed powerful god tools, so they wouldn't necessarily be afraid of the rank 3 king tiers, either. Ling Han's next opponent was one such a rank 2 king tier. They were at the consummate level of the heavenly body tier, and they were more so holding a pseudo-saint tool in their hands. This person was none other than Nai Tiancheng. Chapter 1488, The Unfortunate Nai Tiancheng. 1488 The Unfortunate Nai Tiancheng. Ling Han. There was a dark expression on Nai Tiancheng's face. He had been ambushed by Ling Han in the sunken abyss valley, causing him to fall to the floor of the valley. That had been utterly humiliating. He didn't feel that he was weaker than Ling Han. Rather, he felt that he had only been defeated because his cultivation level had been suppressed too much. If they had battled against each other at full power, He was confident that he could have suppressed Ling Han with a single hand. However, in the end, Ling Han had ascended the golden boulder and obtained the bulk of the benefits. Meanwhile, he had fallen to the floor of the valley again. This caused him to detest Ling Han even more. Right now, his cultivation level wasn't being suppressed anymore. Moreover, he also had a pseudo-saint tool in his hands. Thus, suppressing Ling Han would be mere child's play. So what if Ling Han was the second disciple to be recruited? Humph. Today, I'm going to exact my revenge, he said balefully. Ling Han shook his head. This person was truly a self-centered being. What had he done wrong? They had been teammates at that time, yet Nai Tiancheng and Shan Jingyi had actually tried to steal Empress Luan Xing from him. Afterward, they had committed all kinds of reprehensible acts, trying to ambush and attack Ling Han. Thus, Ling Han had no choice but to act first. How could they blame him? You're asking for a beating. Ling Han had never been a good-tempered person, and his expression instantly became cold. He reached toward Nai Tiancheng. Nai Tiancheng still thought that Ling Han was only at the medium extreme of the heavenly body tier. However, after the competition in the Sunken Abyss Valley, Ling Han had already advanced to the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier. He had advanced even further now, and he had already broken through to the Eternal River tier. Even if Ling Han hadn't engraved 10 killing formations inside his body, he would have still possessed the ability to battle against an Eternal River tier cultivator, even if they possessed a pseudo-saint tool. Right now, the result was already set in stone. A cold smile stretched across Nai Tiancheng's face. Ling Han was actively charging over to attack him. Just how audacious was he? However, a stunned expression instantly appeared on his face. What? Why was Ling Han's attack so overwhelming? It was as if even heaven and earth were about to collapse. Holy fuck. This isn't the medium extreme of the heavenly body tier. He hurriedly activated his pseudo-saint tool. The peach branch lit up, releasing a fragrance that spread 5 kilometers into the surroundings. Peng. He was instantly sent flying back. However, his pseudo-saint tool finally managed to unleash its might and block Ling Han's attack. After all, Ling Han was afraid of accidentally killing this ant, so he hadn't attacked with his full strength. Pu. Nai Tiancheng coughed up a mouthful of blood. He had only been struck by the remnant shockwaves, but just how powerful was Ling Han at this moment? He had only been scraped by the shockwaves, yet he was still wounded. How is this possible? He shouted. There was a dumbfounded look on his face. How could he not be stunned? Around 11 or 12 years ago, Ling Han had still only been at the medium extreme of the heavenly body tier. Now, however, he had actually advanced to the Eternal River tier. How could this be? It was simply unfathomable. He had definitely received huge benefits from the gigantic golden boulder. Nai Tiancheng gritted his teeth in anger. At that time, he had fallen to the floor of the valley, and failed to receive any benefits. Thus, he had left in disappointment and despondence. He hadn't returned after that, and thus he wasn't aware that Ling Han had engaged in an intense battle with Jiyu Daoyi. Upon seeing Ling Han being recruited second, he had thought that this was because he had ascended the gigantic golden boulder. In other words, he had never taken Ling Han's strength seriously. Only now did he finally realize that Ling Han's cultivation level had already surpassed his. Detestable brat, he spat through gritted teeth. In his eyes, if it weren't for Ling Han, he could have definitely obtained huge benefits in the Sunken Abyss Valley and reached the Eternal River tier by now. He didn't reflect on his own actions at all, instead shifting all of the blame onto Ling Han. The more he looked, the more detestable Ling Han appeared. He waved his right arm and activated his pseudo-saint tool with all of his might. If he could activate the full power of the pseudo-saint tool, the might that he unleashed could be on par with the pinnacle level of the Eternal River tier. It would be equivalent to forming 2 million heavenly bodies. However, it was a shame that his cultivation level was still far too low. After using his full strength, he could only unleash a might that was on par with the early stage of the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier. However, this was already very impressive. This was enough to kill elites at the low extreme of the Eternal River tier and rival elites at the medium extreme of the Eternal River tier. Die. He raised the peach branch and swept it toward Ling Han. A pink halo burst into the surroundings, bringing with it a devastating might. Of course, he was only shouting this in anger. Even if he were 100 times more courageous, he still wouldn't dare to kill someone in the academy unless it was by accident. However, he detested Ling Han far too much, so he wouldn't feel comfortable unless he shouted for him to die. Pa! Ling Han's palm lashed out, and he slapped him across the face. There was a loud and crisp crack. Nai Tiancheng was instantly sent flying. His mouth hung wide open, and he couldn't help but spit out several broken teeth. There was a shocked expression on his face. He had activated his pseudo-saint tool with his full power, yet he had still been struck by Ling Han. He genuinely couldn't defeat him. There was a bitter feeling in his mind. However, he could continue to bide his time and exact his revenge in the future. The Star Sand Martial Arts Academy was a place of boundless miracles. Perhaps he was no match for Ling Han now, but this didn't represent that he would be no match for him forever. He was a rank 2 king tier, and he had the potential to become a rank 3 king tier. Once he broke through to the Eternal River tier, his strength would be no weaker than that of Ling Han. As such, was there any need to be stubborn now? Since Ling Han could surpass him, why couldn't he also surpass Ling Han? I admit. Pa. He was just about to admit defeat, yet a large shadow instantly appeared before his eyes. This was a large hand, and it aggressively forced him to swallow the words on the tip of his tongue. This. Are you trying to fucking torture me? I was just about to admit defeat. Nai Tiancheng was infuriated. He hadn't imagined that Ling Han would be so sinister. Pang. With this thought in mind, he suffered another blow to his face. He was almost about to be knocked silly. According to the rules, there were 3 ways that a battle could end. The first was if someone was pushed off the arena, the second was if one lost the ability to battle, and the third was if someone actively admitted defeat. However, Ling Han had forcefully stopped him from admitting defeat, and he didn't push him off the arena, either. Instead, he focused on smacking his face around. However, he didn't use too much power, and nothing he did would cause the battle to end. Thus, even though there were many Eternal River tier elites observing the battle, there was nothing more they could do to help. Ling Han and Nai Tiancheng were still battling, so how could they conclude the battle? Impressive. I respect that you're a true man. You're unwilling to yield even in the face of death, Ling Han said as he continued to slap Nai Tiancheng. Respect your mom. Unwilling to yield Maya *SS. Nai Tiancheng was already on the verge of tears. This was far too vexing. Ling Han had already won, so why was he still intent on torturing him? Pa. Ling Han continued to slap his face. Each time Nai Tiancheng opened his mouth, Ling Han would immediately shut him up with a slap. Pa. There was a strong sense of rhythm to this, and it was as if they were singing a duet. This amused many of the spectators. Trying to say 3 words was far too difficult. Nai Tiancheng changed his tactic, saying, However, he was still cut off after saying just the first word. In any case, his net word should have been surrender. A smile spread across Ling Han's face. Would he allow Nai Tiancheng to surrender? Nai Tiancheng opened his mouth. Pa. He opened his mouth again. Pa. Upon seeing this, the spectators couldn't help but explode with laughter. Although Nai Tiancheng couldn't say I surrender regardless of how hard he tried, everyone could tell that he was trying to admit defeat. What an unfortunate soul. Enough, an elite shouted. He couldn't watch on any longer, so he forcefully ended their battle. Ling Han only stopped because he didn't want to cause too much trouble. Otherwise, the elite mightn't have been able to stop him from attacking. There was rage in Nai Tiancheng's eyes as he glared at Ling Han, yet there was an even stronger sense of fear. Although he hadn't been pummeled for long, he had already started to wonder whether he would be forcefully beaten to death. This left him with severe psychological trauma. Perhaps. I won't exact revenge, he thought to himself. The battles on the other arenas were still ongoing. Some were wrapped up extremely quickly, while others were intense and drawn out. Only after 8 days were the final 16 all decided. Chapter 1489, Clash of Bulls. Chapter 1489, Clash of Bulls. The 7 rank 3 king tiers had naturally advanced into the top 16. Meanwhile, there were no underdogs among the top 16. Apart from the rank 3 king tiers, the Rain Emperor and the Notionless Saint had also managed to advance. They had both silently broken through to the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier. Otherwise, there was no way they could have defeated opponents who wielded powerful and high-level god tools. Taking them into account, 4 of the top 16 king tiers had all come from Joint Peace Planet. This was absolutely astonishing. However, it was a shame that Ding Ping and Zhou Yao hadn't managed to make it into the top 16. After all, their cultivation levels were still too low. Meanwhile, Shu Ran hadn't advanced to the Eternal River tier or pinnacle level of the Heavenly Body tier, either. Thus, even though he was extremely talented, he still appeared quite ordinary when compared with the plethora of king tiers in the academy. They drew lots again before being divided into 2 separate brackets. Each bracket would have 1 victor, and these victors would battle for the title of the strongest. Only the final victor would receive rewards. The other people would all be stepping stones. Ling Han observed their situation. He and Empress Luan Xing had both been assigned to different brackets. However, Empress Luan Xing and Jiyu Daoi were in the same bracket. This meant that it was extremely likely that they would eventually come across each other. They were destined to fight an intense battle. Meanwhile, the Rain Emperor was also in the same bracket as Empress Luan Xing. As such, there was little chance that he could emerge as the victor of that bracket. After all, he still had yet to advance to the Eternal River tier. Although the other bracket didn't have Jiyu Daoi, it was still stacked with tremendously powerful individuals. There was Long Xiangyue, second in the world, and Hong Ma. In fact, Ling Han's next opponent was none other than second in the world. This was definitely going to be a ferocious battle between supreme king tiers. However, Long Xiangyue immediately ran over and pointed a slender finger at Ling Han's nose, saying, "I'm definitely going to defeat you. So, don't lose before the semi-final." She could only meet Ling Han if they both advanced to the final battle of their bracket. Second in the world was standing beside them, and he couldn't help but grimace. "Are you just going to ignore my feelings?" Ling Han smiled faintly. Both Long Xiangyue and second in the world had already advanced to the Eternal River tier. It could be said that they were powerful opponents. "Where are the adults of your tribe? Have any of them broken through to become true dragons? I want to purchase a dragon horn from you guys. I'm open to any requests and discussions," Ling Han said. He still dares to raise this issue? Long Xiangyue's expression grew even darker. Someone in her tribe had indeed broken through to become a true dragon. That was her auntie. She was a supreme prodigy of the Long tribe, and she was more so breathtakingly beautiful. In fact, she was even more beautiful than Long Xiangyue. Was Ling Han not satisfied with her? Pay. I've got nothing to do with him. You're trying to target my auntie. In your dreams, she said coldly. This stinky man was truly greedy. Ling Han didn't know about the strange rules of their tribe, so he couldn't help but grumble in his mind. I didn't do anything untoward, so why are you treating me with such hostility? I didn't say that I was trying to snatch a dragon horn, either. Rather, I'm proposing a fair exchange. Is there any need to become so angry? Women, what mysterious beings. Ling Han, I've been yearning to battle against you for a long time, second in the world said, his voice booming like thunder. His physique was astonishing, and he looked much like a barbaric bear. Standing before him, Ling Han looked much like a young child. Ling Han smiled, and said, "Then let us battle to our heart's content." As you wish. They still had yet to battle, but there were already sparks flying between them. This sent waves of excitement through the people standing in the surroundings. They were eager to see these 2 king tiers do battle straight away. The battle between them would definitely be spectacular. It wasn't long before the 8 battles all started at the same time. Ling Han faced off against Second in the World. Second in the World didn't underestimate him. He immediately let out a huge roar, and black hair instantly started to grow from his body. He had already looked like a barbaric bear just then, and at this moment, he barely looked human anymore. Fangs started to protrude from his mouth, and his fingernails also became long and black. A cold glow shimmered around him, and his physique was enough to instill apprehension in his opponent's mind. It was as if he were a gigantic beast from the ancient past. Iron Bone Barbaric Bear Bloodline, someone exclaimed in astonishment. Ling Han's heart shuddered. Iron Bone Barbaric Bears were ancient divine beasts, and although they were slightly inferior to true dragons, powerful Iron Bone Barbaric Bears were still Genesis tier saints. They were incredibly terrifying. Roar! Second in the World bellowed loudly before aggressively striding toward Ling Han. He was like a battle chariot hurtling toward Ling Han. The physique of Iron Bone Barbaric Bears was top-notch in the world. These were beasts that could rival even true dragons. Ling Han wore a strange expression. His opponent was charging over to engage in close-quarter combat. Where had his courage come from? Perhaps the physique of Iron Bone Barbaric Bears was top-notch in the world. They could indeed challenge true dragons to some extent. However, this was merely the case in the immortal realm. Ling Han had practiced the indestructible Heaven's Scroll, and the offensive ability of this technique was a solid 0. However, its defensive ability, Ling Han also charged toward Second in the World. Peng! Neither of them shirked, and it was only natural that they went straight into one another. Both of them were sent stumbling back. They were rank 3 king tiers, and were both at the low extreme of the Eternal River tier. Thus, it could be said that their power was almost identical. Second in the World shook his head. The collision just then had made him feel a little dizzy. However, he immediately smiled, and said, "Among those at the same cultivation level as me, I've yet to come across anyone who dares to battle against me head-on. How many more collisions can you withstand?" "As many as you want," Ling Han replied calmly. The collision just then hadn't affected him in the least. "Fine." Second in the World replied with a loud laugh. He charged toward Ling Han again. However, dark light started to emanate from his body as he charged forward, allowing his speed to become quicker and his power to become greater. Ling Han naturally wouldn't cower, and he also charged toward his opponent. Peng! 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 The two of them continued to collide with each other. These were genuine body-on-body collisions, and there wasn't anything to cushion the force of their impact. The spectators were all stunned, yet they found this battle to be somewhat hilarious. This was a battle between Supreme King tiers, yet they were actually charging at each other like two bulls. Where was their demeanor as elites? However, apart from Ling Han and Second in the World, who else dared to battle like this? Perhaps their bones would all be broken after a dozen or so collisions. After all, just how violent were these collisions? Nonetheless, the two king tiers continued to charge at each other as if they didn't feel any pain. Before long, they had already collided with each other over 100 times. The spectators couldn't help but feel admiration. However, which of them could know that Second in the World was actually experiencing unspeakable distress? He knew that his physique was incredibly powerful, so he especially liked to use these kinds of methods to defeat his opponents. He could completely crush his opponents both physically and mentally. In reality, this was indeed the case when he battled against opponents at the same cultivation level. No one could face his attacks head-on. Now, however, his vision was blurry and his stomach was in turmoil. He was feeling incredibly nauseous, and it was as if he were about to vomit his guts out. At this moment, he felt like he was just an ordinary person. Meanwhile, Ling Han was like a boulder. When an ordinary person tried to charge at a boulder, it was much like trying to smash a rock with an egg. Fuck, which of us possesses the Iron Bone Barbaric Bear bloodline? Can you be more reasonable? How is your physique even tougher than mine? Ling Han smiled faintly, and asked, again? Of course. Second in the World gritted his teeth as he struggled on. This type of battle was his strength, so he would have no face to show himself if he were defeated by Ling Han. Peng. 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 The two of them collided with each other again, and their battle was like a clash between bulls. However, those with a sharp eye quickly discovered that second in the world was becoming slower and slower. As he became slower, the force of his charges naturally grew weaker as well. Although second in the world was still stubborn in appearance, he was already becoming afraid of Ling Han in his mind. He couldn't help but subconsciously reduce the force of his attacks. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.